Good Sunday morning. Election season is upon us here in New Mexico with just 43 days until the November election. We have a lot of new polling numbers to share with you this morning. Thanks for joining us for Eye on New Mexico. I'm Griffin Rushton. KOB4 partnered with Survey USA to find out what New Mexicans think about the elected leaders we have in office right now. More than 700 New Mexico voters participated in a survey earlier this month, and the approval ratings are in. Of course, we're going to start at the top with President Joe Biden. He's nearing the end of his one and only term after dropping his re-election campaign just 2 months ago. And according to our survey results, it seems New Mexicans aren't very thrilled with his 4 years in office. He has a net approval rating of -13, with a little over half of all respondents say they disapprove of his performance, and 40%, this big red chunk right here, say they strongly disapprove. Now, it is a big drop for the former VP turned president, whose net approval was sitting at -6 when we pulled New Mexicans back in 2022 before the midterm elections. Now, let's break those numbers down. According to the survey, women in our state are pretty evenly split on Biden's performance, while 60% of men say they disapprove. The majority of white and Hispanic voters now disapprove of Biden's performance, another big shift from 2022 when nearly 60% of Hispanic voters supported Biden. The age bracket is likely the most telling, though. 44% of respondents ages 18 to 34, that's the crucial Gen Z and younger millennial bloc, strongly disapprove of Biden's performance, and that's up a staggering 20 points from just 2 years ago. Now, we asked the president of Survey USA to help us break down these numbers, and he says that surge of disapproval from younger voters is a trend happening all over the country.
We're seeing respondents who are a lot less Democratic leaning and a lot more Republican leaning than I think conventional wisdom would suggest. We looked really closely at it year by year. This isn't reflected in any of the data, but we looked at it, for each individual year of age in that range, and we found this, it's really 30 to 34-year-olds in particular. We don't yet have a theory as to what's going on there, but that's where that difference is.
Now, it probably comes as no surprise that conservative voters disapprove of Biden's performance, but he's also losing support from his own voters here in New Mexico, with only 76% supporting him now, down from 87% just 2 years ago. Now, he's also losing support from moderate voters, that's this purple block right here, who now disapprove of his performance more than they did back in 2022. Now, all of this is potentially underscoring why the president decided to drop his re-election campaign. And with that, let's talk about the current Democratic nominee, Vice President Kamala Harris. The former California Attorney General turned VP has only been on the campaign trail for 2 months now, but it appears she already has solid support from New Mexican voters with a +2 net approval rating, 15 points higher than Biden. And we'll remind you, these results are based on her work as a vice president, not as a presidential candidate. According to our poll, 48% of New Mexicans approve of her work. However, roughly the same number of voters disapprove of her work. Of course, Harris is the first female vice president in U.S. history, and one could argue that's giving her a boost down here with female voters in New Mexico. But take a look at this. 51% of men disapprove of Harris, and that includes this red block of 43% strongly disapproving of Harris, signaling that there are a lot of passionate opinions about Kamala Harris.
Not atypical. I'm sure Hillary Clinton can tell a similar story, and her numbers obviously told a similar story. The gender gap is not uncommon, and how much of that is just politics and how much of that is an artifact of, sexism is, hard to discern, but it's out there.
Now, when it comes to race, 46%, nearly half of white voters in New Mexico, strongly disapprove of Harris, the same as Biden, while more than half of Hispanic and other non-white voters approve of her in some regard. Now, let's take another look at that Gen Z and young millennial bloc, again, where Kamala Harris seems to be in the same boat as President Biden. 58% of young voters in New Mexico disapprove of her performance in office, more than any other age bracket. But she still has a strong base with liberal New Mexicans, with 55% saying they strongly approve of her performance. And it's worth noting that 23% of conservative voters, that's this gray block down here, also approve of Harris's performance. Now, according to our poll, Kamala Harris does have more support from New Mexicans who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 than President Biden does right now. You can see this little green box right here. It's about 9% support, but it's small, but it's going to be an important number to watch as we approach the November election, where, of course, it's VP Harris versus former President Trump.
It could show that she has some crossover appeal. It could show that there are some people who voted for him in the past who weren't going to vote for him against Joe Biden, who very well may be considering her.
Biden and Harris won New Mexico back in 2020 with an 11-point lead over Trump, and it seems Harris is still maintaining a solid lead 4 years later. 538 Interactives combined several recent polls and determined Harris has a comfortable 9-point lead over President Trump in New Mexico, at least right now. Now let's talk about someone who is not facing a vote this November. Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. She's about halfway through her second term, now 6 years in office. And according to our poll, New Mexican voters are relatively split on her performance, but still positive. She has a +2 net approval rating, but that is down 3 points from 2022, just before she was reelected. Now, the governor has a little more support from women in the state than men. Roughly 50% of men disapprove of the governor, but unlike Kamala Harris, there's not as many men in the strongly disapprove bucket, which is a good sign for the governor. Now, more than half of white voters in New Mexico disapprove of Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's performance, and we did see that back in 2022 as well. Hispanic and other non-white voters largely support the governor still, but survey data shows that support is waning, especially among Hispanic voters. Now, the governor's approval ratings are pretty steady among all age brackets, but again, let's take a look at this younger block. About 14% of those young voters say they're unsure about her performance, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's not great for her either, considering she's been in office for 6 years now. Now, the governor is doing extremely well with her own party, with only about 15% of Democrats saying they disapprove of her performance. Now, she's crossing the political aisle as well, with 18% of Republicans and about 34% of independents saying they approve of her performance in office, both of these outpacing President Biden's approval ratings for both groups.
It doesn't look like a bad year for Democrats in New Mexico looking at the approval numbers, I would say.
Now, let's put a pin in that as we turn to New Mexico's 2 U.S. senators, Martin Hinrich and Ray Luhan. Hinrich is nearing the end of his second term, and he is running for a third. He's been a member of New Mexico's congressional delegation since 2008, but according to our poll, most New Mexicans don't seem to have a very strong opinion on him. Now, he does have a pretty healthy +7 net approval rating, with 42% of respondents approving of his performance and only 35% disapproving of his rating. But here's the key number. 22% say they are just not sure. That's about 1/5 of voters. And we'll note, less than 10% of respondents said they were unsure about President Biden, VP Harris, and the governor's performance. So despite his 16 years in Congress, it appears many New Mexicans are still learning about Hinrich.
For 1 in 5 voters not being sure about whether they, have a favorable or unfavorable or approve or disapprove of his job performance, not terrific, but it does sort of show, especially this is one of the challenges. If you're on the ballot, whether you're running for, town council or whether you're running for U.S. Senate, if you're on the ballot in a presidential year, 1/5 of the people voting, even if you're a U.S. senator, aren't really paying attention. And, that's where coattails come into effect.
Yeah, that trend is especially apparent when we look at the age brackets. Again, nearly 1/3 of that Gen Z and younger millennial block over here say they're unsure about Hinrich's performance, and 1/4 of 35 to 49-year-olds are in the same boat. Now, when it comes to the voters who do know about Hinrich's work, he's doing all right. He's got a 75% approval rating among liberal voters and 47% among moderates. Now, more than half of conservatives disapprove of the Democrats' Democrats' performance, but nearly 30%, this big yellow block right here, say they're unsure. And that's probably a good thing, as Hinrich is getting ready to preparing to fend off Republican Nella Domenici in the November election. Now, we teamed up with Survey USA again to find out where New Mexican voters stand on that race, and we're going to reveal those results tonight after the game. As for Senator Ray Luhan, he's about halfway through his first term in the Senate, but he served in New Mexico's congressional delegation since 2009. And just like his colleague, it seems many New Mexico voters are still learning who Ray Luhan is. He has an incredibly strong plus 13 net approval rating, with only 32 of respondents saying they disapprove of his performance. But again, take a look at this 23% of voters who say they're just not sure. It's pretty high for a long-standing congressman, but again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, especially considering where he's at in his term and this net approval rating right here.
The highest number in the poll was a plus 13 for Senator Lujan, which is a particularly strong number. And I think that probably makes sense because he's not in the middle of a campaign this year. So whatever he's got out there, there's no negatives really coming in on him.
Now, survey results show the Democrat, like Hinrich, is doing well at crossing the political aisle. 48% of moderate voters approve of his performance, and so do 29% of conservative voters. That's coupled up with a 73% approval rating from liberal voters. But again, there's still a considerable number of unsure voters in all three groups, which means there's still definitely room for him to grow. Now, we've got even more numbers coming up for you after a quick break, including just how many New Mexicans admit they are not registered to vote. And we're going to be breaking down another survey among some political candidates here in New Mexico, revealing where they stand on efforts to modernize our legislature. We are only 43 days away from the November election, and at this point, it's a numbers game for most candidates. Who can get more registered voters to submit a ballot? KOB4 teamed up with Survey USA to find out just how many New Mexicans are registered to vote. And according to the data, the vast majority of New Mexicans already are, 83%. Now, 1% of respondents say they're actually not sure, but that means 16% of New Mexicans are not registered to vote. And the data is pretty clear who falls in that bucket. Roughly a quarter of Gen Z and young millennial voters say they're not registered to vote, while nearly 100% of New Mexicans 65 and up do say they are registered. Now, looking at ethnicities, 17% of Hispanic respondents say they are not registered to vote, along with 28% of other non-white voters. Now, the vast majority of Democrats and Republicans say they're registered to vote, but nearly a quarter of independents say they're not registered to vote. And here is another key number to look at. Nearly a third of renters say they're not registered, while 90% of homeowners are. And the data suggests that's more extreme in the rural parts of New Mexico. Now, all of those numbers may not seem very extreme, but the president of Survey USA suggests those non-registered voter numbers may actually be higher than the data shows.
When you start asking people about politics, the people who don't participate in politics because they're not registered to vote sort of self-select themselves out of the poll. So same thing here. You'll see registration numbers that are higher than realistic, most likely because so many people who aren't registered, as soon as they see that it's a poll about politics, they don't participate.
Now, here's the good news, though. There is no hard deadline to register to vote in New Mexico. New Mexicans can register in person at polling places on Election Day. Of course, that is the deadline to cast your vote. We're going to post everything you need to know about that process up on KOB.com. Presidents and senators are not the only candidates on the ballot this year. There's also dozens of legislative races to know about, but not as many as you might expect. There are 112 legislative districts across New Mexico, split between the House and the Senate. And more than half of those districts, 66 of those seats, are all unopposed this election season. That means a lot of familiar faces are sticking around the Roundhouse. Now, there are plenty of issues and topics to ask candidates about before we head to the polls. But but a group of nonprofits, including Common Cause New Mexico and New Mexico Open Elections, surveyed a batch of candidates about some democracy-focused issues, including how New Mexico's elections should operate. And according to their poll, candidates from both sides of the aisle, a vast majority of them are supporting a shift to semi-open primaries here in New Mexico. We're talking 87% in favor compared to just 5% who are opposing this. Now, right now, only registered Democrats and Republicans can vote in the state's respective primaries. A semi-open primary would allow independent or unaffiliated voters to pick one of those primaries to participate in, and advocates believe that could drastically increase voter participation.
Right now, 300,000 New Mexicans, almost a quarter of voters, are excluded from primaries, which are our most consequential elections. They determine 80% of our elections, right? So we believe this is a really important issue to make sure that all voters have a voice.
Now, their survey also asked candidates if they support ranked choice voting in state elections. This is something that already exists in cities like Santa Fe and Las Cruces. Instead of picking one candidate, voters rank their top choices. And if a candidate wins with more than 50% of votes, they win. If no candidate reaches that 50% mark, the bottom candidate is eliminated. And those rankings are factored in until someone does hit that 50% mark. Now, despite already existing in several cities, only 56% of candidates said they would support ranked choice voting, and 18% said they would oppose the change. Advocates still believe it is the way forward.
We all have a natural way of ranking our decisions here, ranking our decisions as people. And so being able to do this in our electoral process not only makes things more equitable, but it allows for the person who does become the elected candidate to have a true majority, because they are typically someone's first or second choice rather than the system that we have now.
And while we're talking about elections, let's go back to these legislative district maps. These borders are typically drawn up by the state lawmakers who represent these districts. Now, there was some back and forth with the governor and courts the last time this map was updated, but advocates believe elected officials just should not be part of this process. And according to their survey, 87% of candidates this year would support an independent redistricting commission, giving everyday New Mexicans more power in drawing up those political boundaries.
When you are a serving elected official, it's hard to separate yourself from the redistricting process in a political way. There was just a New Mexico Supreme Court case on this issue where a certain amount of partisan gerrymandering is allowed, is what they determined. However, we believe that everyone should be counted equally and fairly, and in order to do that, we need a completely independent process.
Now let's shift over to the Roundhouse, where it appears there's a lot of support behind modernizing New Mexico's legislature. Right now, lawmakers alternate between 60-day and 30-day legislative sessions each year, and according to their survey, the vast 89% of candidates running this year support moving to 60-day legislative sessions every year. Now, this is an issue state lawmakers have already tried addressing in recent years. Many believe 30-day sessions like the one we had earlier this year are just not long enough to adequately address the issues New Mexico is facing, and advocates say it's clear the current system is not working.
Legislators have admitted to mistakes happening because of how short the session is. I don't think it's typical to see elected officials or politicians admitting mistakes, so I think that's a pretty good sign that people want that to change.
Now, we can't talk about legislative session lengths without talking about the governor's call. During those 30-day sessions, the governor essentially gets to control what bills move forward, something state lawmakers have criticized in recent years. However, according to the survey, only 41% of candidates running this year would support getting rid of the governor's call, and only 18% oppose the idea, which suggests there are a lot of candidates who just aren't sure what to think about this.
I think that may be more indicative of not wanting to overstep the responsibilities and the power of somebody who's running for office and not actually serving. The bottom line is that there is a little bit of an imbalance between the legislative branch and the executive branch. We hear it a lot from legislators who serve in office, and we just had a special session that only lasted for a couple of hours. So something isn't working with the executive branch being able to control the agenda of the legislative session.
Now let's talk about another modernization issue that's gained a lot of support in recent years: state lawmakers' salaries. New Mexico is currently the only state that doesn't provide its lawmakers with a true salary. They do receive a per diem, but you'll notice many state lawmakers still have day jobs or are retired from their careers. Now it appears many candidates are ready for that to change, with an 84% saying that they would support legislative compensation reform. Now a few minutes ago, we told you 66 out of 112 legislative races this year are unopposed, and advocates believe the lack of a salary is a big reason why many New Mexicans just don't run for state office.
When we talk about compensation for legislators, we're really talking about making our New Mexico state legislature look more like New Mexico, having more people from different lived experiences and backgrounds having the opportunity to run for office, and finances shouldn't be a stop for that.
Now, while we're talking about money, the survey also asked candidates about increased financial disclosure requirements for elected officials. And a pretty solid 79% say they would support increased requirements. Only 2% said they would oppose it, signaling some candidates still on the fence here. Now, it appears there's also an appetite to increase disclosure requirements for lobbyist activities. According to the survey, 89% of candidates are on board and 0% would oppose the effort. Now, advocates say this is an issue they've heard about many times before.
That's something that we hear a lot from both the legislators themselves and New Mexicans. Because our legislative session is pretty short, and because our legislators don't have, at the time they didn't have staff, now they do, it allowed for special interest groups and lobbyists to come in and talk about their agenda with legislators, and unfortunately that may push out constituent concerns. We understand that the role of lobbyists is important, especially for organizations like ours. However, we think that if you are going to be a lobbyist, you do need to be clear on what you are lobbying for, and especially if there are issues that you're supporting and opposing that conflict each other.
Again, all of those survey results came from candidates running for seats in both the state house and state senate, and a few congressional candidates. Now, only time will tell, though, if all that support we're seeing in the data actually leads to successful reform efforts.
My efforts leading the PED will be focused on demonstrating measurable growth.
There's a new public education secretary on the job, a sentence we've told you 5 times in just 5 years, but she's not the only new person joining the governor's team. Our elected leaders are one thing, but there's a whole other batch of leaders in our state who are not picked by voters. We're talking about the governor's cabinet secretaries, of course, and she's been filling a lot of open seats lately. The governor appointed Rob Black from the New Mexico Chamber of Commerce to lead the state's Economic Development Department, taking over for Mark Roper, who filled in since January. The governor also picked Manny Barreras to lead the Department of Information Technology, which oversees broadband expansion efforts across the state. There's also a new state engineer on the job, Elizabeth Anderson. She's actually the first female state engineer in state history, now in charge of managing the state's water resources. But the most notable appointment by far is the governor's new public education secretary, her 5th in just 5 years. Mariana Padilla is now leading the department after Dr. Arsenio Romero abruptly stepped down, and she's not new to the governor's administration or the PED.
I really am uniquely positioned in a way that no other secretary has been before.
Mariana Padilla is no stranger to New Mexico's public education system. She was an elementary school teacher in the South Valley before joining Michelle Lujan Grisham's congressional team, eventually following the now governor to Santa Fe, where she served as director of the Children's Cabinet since 2019.
I have been one of the key people that have implemented the governor's cradle to career education agenda in this state.
All that's to say, she was around for all 4 of the governor's previous PED secretaries and seems to know what work needs to be done.
I, like other parents around the state, want our children to feel good about being in school and to be engaged when they're there.
I'm curious to know what you think is the biggest challenge New Mexico's public education system is facing right now.
Chronic absenteeism is a big issue. It's not just an issue in New Mexico, it's a national issue. And it has really grown post-pandemic. Our kids cannot learn and cannot improve if they're not in the classroom. every day.
Padilla noted there was a 7% improvement in attendance last school year, and she added the state is making progress on improving literacy rates.
Which of these letters come first in the alphabet?
It's happening, but we need to get much better about our implementation side of structured literacy. Making sure that it's being done in every single classroom in every school.
Padilla is only expected to lead the department through the governor's final 2 years in office. But considering she is now the 5th PED secretary, we had to ask if she plans on sticking around that long.
When I joined this administration on day one, I committed to do everything I could for the children of our state. And I committed to stay till the end. And that is what I intend to do at the public education department.
We'll be posting all those new poll results and other survey answers up on KOB.com. Thanks for watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another Eye on New Mexico.